Welcome everyone to today's event, Make It Easy, 4 ways to apply behavioural science to public policy and business. So if that is not the event you think you're attending, you can leave now. But we're very pleased to have you all here. So we're going to be bringing the EAST principles to life by showing the results that they've achieved in public policy, in business and beyond. Before we get into it, I just wanted to cover some housekeeping things. So I'm inviting you as the audience to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to make comments, ask questions through the event. I will be monitoring those and we'll have the Q&A later. If you need closed captions, those can be accessed via the LinkedIn live streams. You'll find those there. So my name is Elspeth Kirkman. I am Nesta's Chief Programmes Officer. I also worked at BIT for the best part of a decade and was around when we did the first iteration of EAST, so it's really special to be able to MC this event. For those who are unfamiliar, BIT is a global research and innovation consultancy which uses a deep understanding of human behaviour to improve people's lives. And we work with all levels of government, non-profits, the private sector around the world, applying behavioural science expertise and robust evaluation and using data to help clients achieve their goals. And today we are very lucky to be joined by BIT's Chief Behavioural Scientist, Dr. Michael Hallsworth, and we're going to explore the newly updated EAST framework, which is a simple and effective guide for understanding behaviour. So Michael is a very impressive man. For 20 years, he's worked as both official and an advisor to various governments, and he's been a leading figure in applying behavioural science to address practical problems. Michael and I co-authored a book, Behavioural Insights, from MIT Press. And his new book, The Hypocrisy Trap, will be published in 2025. And since we're plugging books, you can also buy mine, Decisionscape, at any and all good bookstores. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Michael, who will present us the refreshed version of the EAST framework.
Thanks so much, Elspeth, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to be talking about EAST, and to do that, I'm going to need to present my slides, which will come up now. So that's wonderful. So today, I'm going to be talking about some of the basics of EAST, but I'm also going to be talking about some of the examples that maybe people haven't heard about so much, and I'm going to go a bit deeper at some points. So this is going to cover a few different bases and hopefully be engaging for people who both know EAST and those who are unfamiliar. So Elspeth mentioned this briefly, so I'm not going to talk about it in much detail, but a bit we work with behavioural science to apply various findings about human behavior to practical issues. And we're a global organization that works around the world. I'm talking to you from New York City. So today, EAST, it's a framework that we created over a decade ago now. And recently, a couple of months ago, we published a revised and updated version. And the process of doing that was really interesting. It was a good marker for how things have changed over the last decade. And Elspeth and I are going to reflect on that a bit later. But I'm going to be talking about EAST, and I think it's just worth saying what I'm not talking about as well, because this is one part of the picture. And so, people may be asking, what about different aspects of behavioral science? What about understanding what's driving behavior? That's not the presentation today. What we're going to be talking about today is, firstly, the fact that EAST doesn't cover everything. EAST is not a comprehensive framework. There are more complicated frameworks that cover more concepts. This is focused. This tries to really strip out many of the potential things and just focus on the things that will matter for you most of the time. That means it's easy to remember. That's its strength. It's also a practical guide. It tries to help you do things. It's not reflective. It doesn't think about how behavioral science should be different. It doesn't think about some of the deeper kind of dimensions to behavioral science and how it's applied. For that, you can see we published things like Manifesto. We have an ongoing series of articles called Big Shifts for Behavioral Science. So you can look to those for understanding the kind of reflective side of it, thinking about where we're going and so on. It also doesn't cover the diagnosis side of things or exploring behaviors. It focuses more on solutions. If you're interested in those things, we have other resources like the test report and the explore report that talk about how to do that. And the other big thing is we tried in the East report to cover a broad range of examples. So rather than just focusing in particular geographic areas or particular policy areas, we tried to range quite widely. And I tried to cover a lot of different examples in this webinar as well. So that's what we're trying to do. What are some of the principles for getting there? I have to mention that context is really important. I'm going to be talking about some general principles, but the way those play out in specific contexts is really important. And that's why understanding different situations is a core part of applying behavioral science effectively. Testing is really important. We've emphasized this from the start, which builds on my previous point. There'll be different factors that affect how these things play out in the real world. And we need to understand what impact is coming along as a result of applying these things. The next principle may seem weird, but it's about being ruthless. So if something had shown not to work in the last decade, if the evidence just isn't there anymore, maybe we got it wrong, then it got removed. We have no real vested interest in terms of keeping something in there if it just looks like it's not working. What we care about is it going to have an impact? So some things have been removed. Not too many, though, is the good news. And if they have been, we talked about why. And then finally, principle is that these ideas, these concepts can and should be applied widely by many different people. And so part of putting these reports out is just try and broaden access. And in fact, AI may be a way in which you can have, for example, a behavioral scientist in your pocket to help advise you on achieving your goals. Okay, so having said all that, if you want someone to do something, make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. What do we mean by this? And can we go a bit deeper to understand how these things play out? So I'm going to talk about easy to start with. You can make something easy by harnessing the power of defaults, reducing the effort required, and simplifying messages. Now, the default is what occurs when people don't make an active choice. Okay, and people have talked about this quite a bit. It's a very famous, if you like, concept in terms of behavioral science. And there is a lot of evidence that defaults have an impact. In some areas, they have less of an impact. There's a famous kind of example around organ donation, which kind of doesn't really play out, even though it's very well known. The effects aren't very clear. But in many other areas, they are clear. In particular, there's been a lot of interest around green defaults for sustainability. Here's an example from China. You know, if you order takeaway or takeout, you often get plastic cutlery as a default. And this experiment basically looked at what happens if you change that default and you have to ask for the cutlery. Again, you can get it if you want it, but you have to choose to receive that. As we see in many different areas, changing the default has a big impact. When this change is introduced in various different Chinese cities, you can see a big jump in the share of orders for people who were not requesting or not getting cutlery. Again, that's a lot of plastic waste that's being removed, and it's things that maybe people didn't really need or want anyway. But the default is now working in a different direction. Okay, so defaults have been talked about quite a lot. What can we talk about in terms of deeper insight into them? Well, one thing to bear in mind is that a default, accepting a default is not the same as choosing no change. Defaults can change over time. And that's really important because you may sign up for something and then that changes over time, you haven't even realized that. And I think that's why kind of oversight of defaults, thinking about this very carefully is really important. Inertia in terms of choice is not the same as inertia in terms of outcomes. Second thing that's kind of interesting, these things play out even with institutions, even with countries. You can see the stat here that defaults even work on the international stage. When you would think that people have a lot of time to consider these choices, and institutions are there to work through choices in depth, defaults still have a big effect. Another point is we often fail to recognize the power of defaults, even though they're well discussed. If you ask people what they think opt-out rates will be, there's kind of a consistent overestimate of how much people will opt out of a default choice. We give some examples in the report. And then finally, when do defaults seem to be most effective? Broadly speaking, when they're seen as a recommendation, there's a reason for them, or when they kind of reflect the status quo, which, as I mentioned at the start of the slide, isn't always the case. If you can't change the default so people don't have to make, I suppose, any effort, you can also reduce the effort required. So here's an example that we worked with the UNDP on, which had a big effect. And this was done about a decade ago. So in a world in which I'm speaking to you via the internet, we're doing a virtual meeting, it may seem obvious what we did. But back then, and in fact, in many places, this is not being applied as a principle to make it easy. So what did we do? We looked at TB medication adherence in Moldova, where there was a real barrier because people had to go to a medical professional, like physically go there and be observed taking the TB medication. That was the setup. So there was an obvious way of reducing friction, which was to move to a video observed therapy. So the patient records a video of them taking the pills rather than having to travel. And that's the evidence of them completing it. Again, there's a big reduction in effort here, and that means we see a big jump in adherence, almost a doubling. This is a real benefit to patients as well. 58 hours saved a month, $30 in transport costs. This is now the standard procedure in Moldova. Again, the principle is the important thing here rather than the specific example. Where are there instances where there are practical effort is built into the process? You know, these kind of friction costs we talk about. Where can those be removed? That will make a big difference to a behavior, and we often do not consider the impact that they can have in terms of the amount of effort. So that's just one example of a dramatic change, but the general principle applies in many instances. And the reverse is also true. Not just reducing the amount of effort, but increasing the amount of effort has an equivalent effect. So example here from the UK, which changed the laws around painkiller packaging in the late 90s, making it more difficult to buy very large jars of painkillers. You couldn't buy more than 2 at a shop at a time. And the study estimated this prevented around 800 deaths in the following decade through reduced suicides and accidental poisonings. So again, additional effort can make a difference. Reducing effort makes a big difference. In terms of practical effort, those are good examples, but what about cognitive effort as well? What about the making it easy to understand what to do? And over the last decade, we've worked on hundreds of forms and letters and websites trying to simplify messages, trying to make it clear what you should do. And I think we can say that there has been, a typical improvement of around 5 percentage points. Hard to generalize, but that's the kind of range we're talking about, thinking that, simplification can mean many different things. Here's one example from our Singapore office. It was about people being asked to complete a safer driving course. You can see the original on the left-hand side. You can see the simplified version on the right, where we try and highlight exactly what you need to do. What is the letter getting at? It may be that when people are confronted with things like this, there's just an intrinsic kind of aversion to, well, what is this? This is unpleasant to have to deal with. I'm not going to engage. Whereas if you can simplify the message and make it seem a lot clearer, you do see a big difference in engagement. In this case, it was 3 percentage points over 5 months. You can see on the right-hand side when people responded, and people were much more likely to respond as soon as they got the letter. But there's also a second peak in that diagram on the right. The blue is the people who got the new letter. And that second peak is the deadline for registering. So you can see people initially reacted when they got the letter and then just before the deadline. So people were actually paying much more attention to what was in the content because it was simplified. Again, a general principle that we can think about in many different situations. How to simplify messages. Here are some brief lessons that we've picked up over the years. Make the key message presented early. Keep language simple, kind of obvious. Be specific about what you're asking people to do. Provide a single point of contact. And then really try to strip out information that's not needed to perform the action. If some things need to be included for legal reasons, kind of put them separately so you can focus on the behavior that you're talking about. And there are some great tips in this book that our collaborator Todd Rogers and Jessica Lasky-Fink have published called Writing for Busy Readers. That's easy. Defaults, message simplification. Attractive is about two main things. Attracting attention and making things attractive in terms of the incentives. So the key thing about attracting attention is we are bombarded by information all the time in our everyday lives, and we've developed mental shortcuts for filtering out that information. So how can things be designed? How can messages be designed, or different behaviors so they make it through those filters and we register them? Really simple example around message salience, as we call it, is some work we did now a decade ago in the UK around missed appointments. I'll explain this very briefly, but 1 in 10 hospital appointments was missed, and we had no idea if putting a different message in the reminder that people got via text message, did that make a difference? We know that the reminder itself did, but did the wording at all make a difference? So we tested a few different things in London in 3 different hospitals. We basically did a few things like removing the friction, making it easier to rearrange if you needed to get a different date. We pointed out that most people do actually attend. As I mentioned, 1 in 10 miss, but 9 in 10 turn up. And we also mentioned the cost to the National Health Service of a missed appointment as calculated by the NHS. And that last message was the one that really broke through to people. It reduced missed appointments by about 24%. Bear in mind, these are really short messages. They don't exceed the length of a text message. But this is equivalent to a lot of appointments every year nationally. And also we know that it's the specific wording that makes the difference. So we ran a follow-up study which just said the general message that not attending might kind of waste money. And that was less effective. It is the specific kind of details that was attracting people's attention, rather than just being like the usual kind of message you might get. It's not just about messages, it's also about what attracts your attention in the environment. So one example would be in the London Underground, they ran a study, an intervention where they highlighted in green where people should be avoiding standing when they're waiting for trains, with the areas they should be keeping clear. This is a kind of built environment intervention, which you can see here. And they found that this reduced the wait times, the dwell times of a train by around 6.5%, around 2.5 seconds. And that's really big in terms of cost benefit. You can see some of the figures here about the financial impact you have by reducing even wait times, but even a small amount in the London Underground. It has also knock-on effects for the whole system. And I'm not going to talk about this in big detail, but this is another example of how marginal changes to behavior can have wider consequences throughout a system. So again, the way we interact with our environment, our attention is drawn to certain things, as in this example. It's not just attracting attention, it's also a question of what you attract attention to. What aspects of a behavior do you emphasize or do you kind of de-emphasize? And this is a kind of idea called framing, which aspects are noted in particular, rather like an artist puts certain things in a frame or excludes them or puts them in the foreground or the background. And you can look at various examples here. Framing is all around us in the way we think about ideas. One really potentially impactful issue is the way we think about, say, vegetarian food, moving away from eating meat so much. This is work we did with the World Resources Institute. People don't like the phrase meat-free breakfast very much, but field-grown breakfast is more appealing. Again, these are kind of framing devices and framing effects around us all the time. Are we thinking enough about the different connotations we have through emphasizing certain things and not others, because they have an impact on behavior, real world outcomes? So then if we think more deeply about attracting attention, sure, like one thing people talk about is tailoring information and personalizing, which can be powerful. But where do you draw the line between what's helpful to someone because it's really tailored and what's unsettling? The people don't like it because it's kind of creepy. Now, there's not enough data about where that line is drawn for people. And I think that's really interesting because there's a lot of attention that goes on about how can you tailor things, particularly in the private sector, but we don't understand enough about what aspects of tailoring people like or dislike. There's also the fact that even if you highlight information really strongly and effectively, people may be motivated to avoid that information for various reasons. And so it might not be a question of information as such. It may be other factors involved that lead to a behavior or not. And then also, like, it may not be obvious what you should choose to highlight. I think a good example of this is if you have ever taken an online survey, sometimes you see these kind of progress bars at the top or bottom talking about how far you are through the survey. That seems like a good idea. And there are kind of principles that make sense there, like you're getting feedback on your progress. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence shows that including these make people less likely to finish surveys. So again, we can't assume that we know what different parts of information will affect behavior. Again, testing is really important. If you think about the other kind of attractive in terms of what incentives work, there are various different options here that behavioral science talks about in terms of enhancing incentives. And just one to highlight is gamification. And so this is where you introduce different kind of aspects like, I don't know, points or feedback or progress or comparisons to make a behavior feel more like a game, more like you're competing or you're progressing, maybe in relation to others. And I'll be honest with you, when I was looking at this evidence to review EAST, I was a bit like, gamification, does it really make a difference? It seems like the evidence is pretty good that it does. So here's an example we did with the Ontario Securities Commission, the regulator in Canada. And we were interested in, does gamification affect how people use online trading platforms? You know, when you can trade stocks yourself directly using these platforms. And if you look at these platforms, there are different elements of gamification that are being used in the real world. Here are some examples in this slide. So what we did was we simulated a trading environment where people did get rewards for doing different trades. And we wanted to see what was the impact of gamifying. So we introduced an element which was you get points for trading a stock. The points are worth very little. They're more symbolic. So what happens when that incentive, that gamified incentive, is introduced? People make around 40% more trades in this platform. Now, that is important because if you are using a trading platform like this, I think the general advice is not to make so many trades because that doesn't generally work out for you in terms of your returns. It does, of course, generate a return for the platforms themselves. So you may have a situation where gamification is being used to increase the volume of trades, and that's not actually helping kind of consumer welfare. So I think there's some really interesting aspects here about how is gamification used in the consumer space and what effects does it have? Because we know from different experiments that it's powerful. There are other ways of enhancing incentives that behavioral science talks about. One that is pretty interesting is around deposit contracts, which are very effective. This is where you kind of you reduce your freedom voluntarily, you lock away a certain reward, so you only get it later if you actually perform an action. So it's like conditional on doing something, you get your money back, or you get more money. The big thing about deposit contracts is they work if people sign up for them, but people don't like signing up for them. Because fair enough, because you're kind of, you're locking away money. That doesn't seem like a great deal. But if you care about the outcome, it is actually really effective. So that's the big thing to remember. They're effective if people sign up for them. Self-image is actually really interesting and important. People are more likely to sign up for something if it's seen as in line with your perceived self-image, if there are reputational benefits. We see, for example, that in referral schemes that are often used in the consumer space, these are less effective if they're anonymous, because people like getting the reputational benefit of helping out a friend by referring them to something. And then finally, pro-social incentives are interesting. They can make a difference to, for example, teams and the way they function. They can be an alternative to pure kind of incentives that provide a monetary return, because they can increase your intrinsic motivation, your buy-in to a purpose, rather than potentially reducing it. So that's attractive. Social is really important. We are social beings. We're influenced by what others do all the time, and we are influencing people all the time. And the three things to think about here are social norms, showing that most other people are doing a desired behavior, recognizing the power of social networks, and creating feelings of reciprocity. So I'm not going to go and give many examples here around social norms. This has been talked about a lot. There are many examples. We're influenced by what others do in the same situation. I'm going to instead talk about some of the deeper aspects here, some of the things to watch out for about when social norms maybe don't work. So you may be in a situation where it isn't that most people do the desired behavior. Actually, there may be a behavior that's in the minority. In that case, it's important to think about, sure, it may be that the behavior is in the minority, but what are people's expectations? What do people think most people do? Because if it turns out that more people are doing something than you anticipated, even if you thought very, very few people were, that moves your perceptions in the right direction, and it can be that corrects a misperception, and it can be effective. The other idea to think about is, even though it's not a majority of people doing things, are the trends positive? Are things moving in the right direction? And there's been some interest around what's called dynamic social norms there, although the jury is kind of still out on how effective they are. Things to watch out for are backfires. So this is where you are actually doing better than other people. And so if you're doing better, you can feel licensed to take a break. Actually, maybe I'm being more energy efficient than my neighbors, so let's use a bit more. Second aspect is thinking about in-groups and out-groups. Social norms are effective if you identify with the group. But if you don't, they can actually backfire. If it's like, yeah, sure, that's interesting, but that's like people who aren't like me, and I'm going to do actually the opposite of that. So that's a really important risk. There's also the risk that you emphasize an undesirable norm. You're concerned about people carrying weapons, and you say that's a really big problem. If you emphasize that, then the message may be, well, you should carry a weapon as well so you can defend yourself. So that can lead to an escalation if you emphasize the undesirable norm. And then finally, this is a really interesting aspect and something people don't think about enough, I think. If you are dealing with a behavior that's like a common good, where you need people so for example, donating blood is a really good example. If you emphasize that most people have done that, then that can backfire, because people think, well, if most people have donated blood, I don't need to. It kind of encourages a free riding. So think carefully about the kind of behavior, and we go into this much more in the report, so check it out. So those are things you need to think about in terms of social norms and working, how they work effectively, but also behaviors spread through social networks. And then one question that comes up is, if behavior spreads through networks, how do we understand how that happens? And in particular, for example, if you want a behavior to be taken up, does it work to target some people as the initial kind of adopters? If so, who should those be? You could maybe select people randomly. You could try and map all the relationships and find out who's got the most connections. Or an interesting idea is you can randomly select people and ask them to nominate their friends to be the adopters. And there's some really great work that's been done in different settings to look at which is the most effective one. So this one was in Honduras, looking at how would you increase multivitamin uptake. And they found that actually the most effective approach was to ask randomly selected people to nominate their friends. I won't go into the reasons why, you can read that in the report, but that was actually more effective than random targeting or mapping everything. And that's really important because it costs a lot of money and time to go around mapping the social relationships. So this is a developing field, but it's super interesting and really important because we're influenced really heavily by our social connections. Then the final thing in terms of social I just want to talk about is reciprocity. So there are two kinds of reciprocity, and it's worth distinguishing them in your minds. One is direct reciprocity, which is where you're more likely to help out someone if they just helped you, okay? So it's the same person, there's kind of a direct exchange. So some work that Elspeth did was, if you get a text from an employment advisor saying, there's a recruitment event, I've booked you a place, good luck, people are much more likely to show up. Some evidence that there's the person texting you has done something and you want to return the favor in some way. You can see the details there. And in fact, all the examples I'm giving you are either published or they're either published in academic journals, or you can get them on blogs. So I try to include the references. The other kind of reciprocity is indirect reciprocity. So this is where it's not like the two people are exchanging things. It's like someone else helped you and you want to like pay it forward, as it were. You're influenced by the other kind of indirect exchanges that happen. And that's really important for society in terms of a functioning society that kind of builds trust and helps each other out. There's a really nice study that I talk about in the report around in Melbourne, in Australia. They did this kind of experiment about, are you more likely to let someone out if you're driving when someone else just let you out? Right? You're going to let a car pull out in front of you when you're driving if someone just let you out a few seconds ago. That's indirect reciprocity. And they found that, yes, that has a big impact on behavior. It almost doubles the rates of people helping someone else out if they were just helped. So it compounds. Indirect reciprocity can make a really big difference in societies. And then one final aspect building on reciprocity is this idea of operational transparency. And that's the idea that if you're providing service, it can be powerful to let someone know that you are working, say, on their case, or you're doing something to respond to their request. We did some work with the UNDP Chile and the Santiago Prosecutor's Office around intimate partner violence and trying to reduce dropout rates from criminal cases. And we found that light touch support, which said how a case was progressing and say what was happening and giving feedback that someone was working on the case, that reduced dropout rates by around 10 percentage points in the process. And again, this didn't cost much, could be built into everyday processes, but provides that kind of operational transparency. And then finally, timely. We're really influenced by the timing of an offer. We often are disproportionately influenced by the immediate impact on us rather than a future impact. And we also can find better ways of planning our future responses to events. Plans can be made more effective for the future. So timing really matters, and it matters in different ways. We can be thinking about the moment of decision, the time of day, or the day of the week. They all make a difference. It can be that a prompt in the moment when someone's about to do something makes a difference, when 5 minutes earlier doesn't. I give an example here around seatbelts. Seatbelt reminders in the moment are much more effective. Time of day, there are day effects. Financial analysts become much more negative on conference calls as the day goes on. And day of the week, some really interesting things, building on the work I mentioned around missed appointments. People are most likely to miss a medical appointment on a Monday, and that decreases throughout the week. So when a hospital shifted their appointments later in the week, that reduced the no-show rate by 10%. So an example of prompting in the moment, this is big work we did with the job platform Indeed. This is pre-COVID, and it looked at, would a timely prompt increase the extent to which jobs were advertised with flexible working options? Just reminding someone in the act of posting a job that they were recruiting for, that they had these options they could select. We found that led to around 6 percentage point increase, 20% increase in the jobs advertised as flexible, and those jobs attracted more applicants. So it's kind of a win-win there, but it only happened because there was a prompt in the moment. Having been told maybe a day before or reminded a day before about these options may not have had the same impact. It's not just the kind of time of day and so on. It's also about how you think about your life, how you think about where you are in your journey, if you like. And so this is kind of a well-known idea that if you're in a period of disruption or flux, you've changed something in your life anyway, you may be more likely to take up a new behavior. So this can also be if you've just decided you're making, say, a fresh start. Example would be some work that Elspeth did in Portland, Oregon, where we were looking at how could you promote the uptake of the bike sharing scheme that was being introduced. And there were various things that worked to promote the scheme in general. But what was really interesting was that we found that if you had recently moved to a street where a bike rack was being installed, you were 4 times more likely to sign up than someone who had been out in that street for a while. So in other words, people who had undergone a change were more likely to sign up because there'd already been some disruption. They're already changing habits regardless. There's also an interesting idea around, if you're struggling to motivate yourself to do something, and something that is onerous or that requires a lot of effort, there's an interesting idea from Wharton School in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, around temptation bundling. So this is the idea you can only unlock a fun thing if you do a hard thing at the same time. The example they gave was they could only access an addictive audiobook while they were at the gym. You had to go there, physically go there, to be able to do the thing you wanted to do. And while you're there, you had to do the thing you didn't want to do so much. So moving away from the specifics here, how can we try and balance out to bring something attractive into the immediate moment to make us also do something that has long-term benefits? So thinking about the importance of the immediate present for us is really important, and you can reorder things to make them more likely to happen. And then finally, helping people make plans for the future. We know that if you think through the future barriers that you're likely to encounter and try to make a plan to work around them, that is much more effective. And this principle of helping people plan can be used in many different settings. One example recently is a WhatsApp chatbot we designed, which helped people make a plan to get a vaccine, and reminded people about the plan they made. And in a trial with 250,000 people, this tripled vaccine uptake compared to the control. So which was no message, and then it was much more effective than a single standalone message as well. So that interactive element where you could make a plan and then get reminded of it and find out information really helped people follow through on a behavior. And that study's in Nature Human Behavior if you want to look at it in more detail. If you want someone to do something, make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. Try to go through the different aspects here, go a bit deeper, and give you some new examples. And with that, I'd like to welcome Elspeth back, and we can talk about what's happened. Before I do that, I just want to sum up with some takeaways about why you should care about any of this stuff. It's kind of interesting, yes, but why do we care? Well, it starts from the principle that evidence matters for good policies, products, and services. That's something I'm just kind of asserting as a principle. And then if you think that's true, then the success of most ventures, of most things you're doing, depends on how people react. We have findings that show that several important assumptions about important assumptions that we make about people and what they're likely to do are not accurate. There are practical frameworks like EAST for applying that knowledge. And this is kind of core to what people do. It's not a tweak and it's not a distraction. It's actually essential to success of what you're doing at its core. Elspeth, hi again. Should we talk about the fact that this decade has seen quite a bit of change in the field of behavioral science?
Yes, let's reflect. Just let's talk a bit about the replication crisis.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think one of the big things that has changed, and there was a question in the chat about this, so good that we're talking about it. One of the really big things that's changed is that a lot of things we thought were true when the first version of the EAST framework came out turned out not to be true, because there has been, as you may know, something of a replication crisis across a lot of different areas of social science. So specific studies that were very seminal and held up as hard truths in fields like psychology, for example, have failed to replicate. Now, this is good news because good science means coming up with a hypothesis, running an experiment to test it, reporting the result, and then having other people independently being able to replicate that. So the fact that we're replicating and failing is not great when it shows sort of systematic issues, but is really good that that replication is happening. And I think one of my big reflections there is that the fundamental principles governing the EAST framework have actually held up really, really well in the face of that. So the specific examples kind of underneath the hood of it may have changed, some have strengthened, some have weakened, but overall these four principles really hold strong.
Yeah, I don't think we're just saying that, because if they hadn't, we'd have changed things. We really would have done, because this stuff only matters insofar as it kind of works. So I think there were things like, there were examples that didn't work anymore and we kind of highlight them. And I think we've come through the replication crisis in the better place, because now I think findings are more reliable. And also just looking at the data available, there's a lot more data. The knowledge is deeper. We have a broader range of examples, and we have a better sense of what's realistic, I think. Because I think 10, 15 years ago, there were a lot of big claims about really big effects and counterintuitive findings. And it's like this one weird trick. And I don't think that most people are in that space, because they recognize this stuff is hard, but we can make a difference. And those differences are valuable. And there's a study that looks at all the work that BIT in the US had done, and looks at an average improvement of 8%. Now that's not hiding anything. That's generally what happened. I think that's valuable, but it's not like that's not like a 30% increase, but it's realistic and it's kind of reliable. And I think also the thing that is tough actually when you present this stuff is you try and talk about general principles, but we also know that, as I mentioned at the start, context is really important. So I'm confident there are things we can generalize about, but then we have to really be sensitive to when the context means those things don't work. And we're building that knowledge of the variation as we go on.
Yeah, and the more we get these large-scale field experiments that are done all over the world with diverse groups of people, the more we learn, because it used to be that we were building on a foundation of academic research conducted in university labs with 21-year-old undergraduates who all fitted a certain set of characteristics. And so you may be learning something about human behaviour, but the humans you're learning about are quite a narrow subset, even if that research does hold up. So I think we're really kind of benefiting from much richer, broader, more international research these days. Should we move into the Q&A, because we've got quite a lot of questions, Michael?
Sure.
Great. So there's some in the chat, and there's some that was submitted in advance. If you do have questions, keep popping them into the chat, and I'll try and get to as many as we can. The one I thought I'd open with was a pre-submitted question, which is, can we talk about whether there are any limitations to the EAST framework? And if so, what are they?
Limitations, sure. So it's not the only framework out there, and some will work better in other instances. So limitations are like it doesn't do the kind of diagnosis. It comes along and sort of thinks about different principles for almost like solutions, if you like. There are more complicated frameworks that talk about more a wider range of what's the word? A wider range of effects on behavior, which aren't in this framework, and which could be important. That's traded off against the fact this is simple and it's easy to remember, and within the categories you can fit quite a lot of stuff in there. It is not a complete solution, but it is really good as a baseline that can be widely used and covers like the really core concepts. But it's not, there are more sophisticated frameworks out there with more things in them, and people should look at those as well. So I think we're upfront about those limitations.
Yeah, I kind of think a good analogy there is it's almost like teaching you how to cook the sort of principles of cooking a particular type of cuisine, but it doesn't give you 400 different exact recipes that you can follow. So good basic principles, it's not going to give you a step-by-step.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And I think that there are other things that we've built on as well. Like you could argue social is really important in terms of connections, but a lot of the stuff that's talked about is focused on individuals as well. And we need to think more broadly about behavior in networks.
Yeah, and that actually brings me on to a really interesting question that Daniel asked in the chat, which is, after 10 years of EAST, where do you sense that behavioural science can make a systemic shift to social, environmental and economic issues versus tweaks that deliver minor changes? And the reason I think that connects to what you were just saying is one of the shifts I think we've seen from the first iteration of EAST to this version of it is that our mental model of whose behaviour we were changing 10 years ago was probably much more individualistic, much more individual consumers, citizens, whoever it might be, doing something differently. And now I think we have a much more kind of sophisticated system level view of how you change behaviour, where we realise that entire systems are kind of a function of the actors that make decisions within them, and you can get these big ripple effects. So, Michael, I don't know whether you've got specific reflections on where we might use behavioural science at that systemic level.
Yeah, and so we talk about this a lot in the manifesto. It has a proposal called See the System. So my short answer is have a look there at some of the proposals that we make. There's also a podcast we did about 2 years ago called From Nudge to Where Now, which is all about this issue of how can you make a systemic change by focusing on individual level behaviors as well. The two levels, if you like, are not separate. They are interconnected. Change can emerge through a series of interactions between individuals to create new systems. That's the idea of complex adaptive systems. And personally, I think there's a massive opportunity to fuse, if you like, knowledge about behavior with knowledge about complex systems. And complex systems sound, well, complex, but they're all around us. A city is a complex system. There's lots of change going on within a structure, and the structure itself can change. So I think we can develop those really practical examples of how change can emerge from interactions and reshape a whole system. And I'd urge you to look at that manifesto and the podcast, because it goes into detail about how that can happen.
And there's another question that I'll maybe pick off with some reflections on the last one. So there's another question around, is there an ethical concern that private entities are leveraging behavioural messaging in a way that exacerbates anxiety, leverages vulnerabilities, etc.? And I think, yes, very much. It's not like this is the sort of sole preserve of people trying to do good in the world, right? Like these sorts of techniques will be being used for bad, and they are being used in manipulative ways. And one of the areas, back to the previous question around opportunities for systemic design, that I think is a huge kind of avenue for social goods, is to look at social media and the design and architecture of social media and what that's trying to get us to do, how it's governing our attention, what it's getting us to talk about, what it's getting us to argue about. All of those things are behavioural design in action, and we can do it for bad or we can do it for good. And it's a really interesting kind of regulatory problem to think about. How do you shape the direction that those platforms develop in such a way that they're life enhancing rather than causing these enormous social rifts for us? So
I think it's a big question about how do you regulate effectively in different spaces. I talked about consumer protection, understanding these kind of dark patterns, as people call it, in online settings that lead you to certain purchases. Definitely that's happening. And the question is, what do you do about it? How do you try to deal with it effectively? And on the ethics point, there's a phrase. I think the key thing is trying to understand in any particular case what are the ethical implications. And there are a few different frameworks for understanding that, one of which is in the book that we wrote about working through these issues, so you can see where exactly the problem is, rather than talking in generalities.
And this is sort of adjacent to another question that we had submitted in advance, which is around how we keep up with emerging technologies such as AI, particularly with respect to understanding their effects on human behaviour. It's a very big question. Do you have thoughts on it, Michael?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people. I mean, there are a lot of people talking about AI, so I'm struggling to say stuff that's new here. But what I think is really important and interesting is not thinking about so much what can AI do for us, if you like, but how do humans interact with AI? In what ways? And how does that influence how the AI is working as well? So I think on that very narrow question of like how do people react differently when something is AI or not, and how do they use AI? I think there's something that the field of behavioral science can add quite a lot to there, because we look at human behavior, and that kind of behavior is in like how do you interact with AI, how do you interpret it, is going to be extremely important. So I feel that's the angle that I'm personally most interested in right now. I think also I mentioned this, but there could be a wider democratizing of insights from behavioral science if an LLM or other kind of AI agent is able to use that. Then that's at people's fingertips, and that's, I think, very helpful for achieving your own goals. So that's a positive thing that I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, I'd kind of add to that as well. I think there's a opportunity with AI and a threat, it depends which way it goes, where one of the kind of very foundational ideas underpinning a lot of behavioural science is that we, Daniel Kahneman sort of had it, that we operate on these two systems. System one, which is this very fast automatic kind of autopilot version of decision making, and system two, which is this sort of deliberative critical thinking engine where we kind of really slow down and consider things properly. And I think used badly, AI could end up stunting our critical thinking, and there is already some emerging research that shows people engage in less critical thinking when they're using an AI co-pilot for certain activities. But a really good version, there's no reason that you couldn't have AI as a kind of co-pilot to help sort of nudge you out of that system one kind of fast decision making, get you to slow down and do things kind of more deliberatively and better when you're about to make a kind of predictable cognitive error. So I think that's a really interesting area of opportunity as well. Very practical question from a slightly lofty set of answers there. A very practical question is, how do you suggest getting leadership buy-in for behavioural science approaches in government where there are barriers from conventional thinking or policies? Have you got any one cool trick ways of getting leadership to buy in, Michael?
I'm not sure I've got all the answers, but the idea is that you're not asking, try and get them to buy into improved outcomes rather than behavioral science, because the way I think about it, behavioral science is a means to an end. I'm not there to promote it as such. I'm there if it can make a better outcome. And there are various ways in which you can go and say, we will give you a certain outcome or some result, even if it doesn't produce exactly what we wanted. By this point, you'll get a kind of concrete finding that you can use. And sometimes people in leadership positions are just really looking for some kind of data or something that they can hold on to, that this is an impact I'm having. That's certainly what we found in the early days, that running even a very simple, quick trial gave people that kind of feedback which felt real. I think another really important thing is this is complementary rather than competing with maybe existing approaches. We often talk about behavioral science as a lens that you can use to see what you're doing right now and think differently about it, rather than an alternative tool. So it can really integrate into current priorities. And then the final obvious thing is, like, use the framing, use the language of leadership, of the organization, of its priorities, and show how it can make a difference. Because that's what people will have in the front of their minds. That's what's salient to them.
And if you, this links to another question that we had pre-submitted, and maybe this is the last one we have time for. If you don't get buy-in to run an experiment, or the conditions don't exist in which you can run an experiment, how do you go about prioritizing what you might test in the absence of that?
Achievement is really good, because we don't always run trials because it's not always possible. But I think there's this developing a mentality of at least trying a few things out and trying to work out what seems to be coming back. That requires, at least some data. So the first thing might be try to make sure your data is reliable. But you can try to get some kind of feedback on how things are developing, even if it's not a formal trial. It's that curiosity of experimenting in a different sense, trying to get feedback and trying to improve. I think it's a really good process for people to be doing in organizations. It's also really helpful to understand what the differences in kinds of evidence, what are the strengths and weaknesses. Randomized trials have some strengths and some weaknesses. And then also finally understanding the biases in your own decision making when you are making decisions in organizations can really help in terms of, maybe I like this particular thing because it has a particular feature. And sort of understanding that in terms of reflection can really help use evidence and data better.
Great, thank you. So that's all we've got time for. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you, Michael, for a brilliant presentation. There's going to be a short survey link that's going to be posted in the chat, which we would be very grateful if you would fill out. And if you're interested in how behavioural science can help solve challenges that you face, then we'd love to hear from you. At BIT, you can stay up to date with the latest insights, research, events. You can subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. You can message either me or Michael directly. But thank you for joining, and have a great rest of your day.